If you're like me, then you got into a consulting or expertise-based business because you love solving problems and you love to help other people. You certainly didn't get into it so you could do marketing and sales. So wouldn't it be great if your marketing and sales was actually just having conversations with people? No more cold calls or pitches or spammy DMs. Just having real conversations with potential clients and with other experts in your field. Is that a pipe dream or is that actually possible? In this episode, I'm going to outline a process that I go through with my clients. I'm going to give you a look behind the scenes at the whole process so that you can take it and implement it yourself.
Welcome to The Recognized Authority, a podcast that helps specialized consultants and domain experts on your journey to become known as an authority in your field. Here is your host, Alastair McDermott.
When I talk to people who listen to the podcast, they tell me that typically they're listening because they're interested in the idea of building authority. And they want to build authority in order to create more visibility because they're an expert who either wants to have more impact on the world, they want to stop working with clients who are a bad fit, they want to get off the hamster wheel of hourly rate projects, and they know that building authority is a way to get there. And building authority is like unlocking the next level of marketing and sales for people in the expert services space. It's unlocking inbound marketing, which is where you receive inbound leads through that recognition and that visibility. And I talked before about what you need to do that, but I'm going to give you a quick recap. First of all, you need to be an expert in what you do. That's table stakes. And you do need to have a niche. So you need to be a specialist of some kind because you can't become a recognized authority in your field if you don't have a field that's built in. And by the way, if you need help with the niching down part, I have a whole podcast, which is effectively a free audio training course called the Specialization Podcast. And that will walk you through a process for picking a niche. So check out specializationpodcast.com if you need help with that. So once you've got those basic pieces in place, you are an expert in what you do and you are sufficiently niche down that you can actually claim authority or claim expertise in that space. And you know what you want to be recognized for, the next thing is to start gaining visibility. And to become recognized is to create a body of work of some kind. So you want to create something which is a body of work that you create in public. The way that I think about this is I think of this as first creating an authority platform. And on that platform is the platform that your body of work exists in. And so you create your authority platform, and then the body of work is made up of all of these different subcomponents. For example, you might have a book or books. You might have a podcast or podcasts. You might guest on other people's podcasts. You might have a blog. You might write LinkedIn posts. All of those things, you get to choose how you create your authority platform. And you get to decide how you want to go ahead and create that. And then by creating this body of work, you're demonstrating and sharing your expertise in public. You're building a reputation, you're building authority, and you're also increasing the surface area. As this grows, this body of work grows, you're increasing the surface area for people to encounter your work. And because you're going out in the world more, you're increasing your visibility and you're becoming known, you're becoming recognized. Now, there are some difficulties that you're going to encounter while you're going through this process. So let's go back for a second to the reason why we want to build authority. And in part, that's because we know that building authority is what will result in inbound leads. It is what will allow us to command premium fees and even change our business model so that we can detach from hourly rate and work on fixed price or value-based pricing or even productized services or even information products and things like that. Unlocking building authority and unlocking authority is what allows you to do all of those things. And so we know that we're doing this in part, particularly at the start, to generate leads. And so we don't want to have to generate leads through cold calls and all of that other stuff that we talked about. So people come to you when you've built authority, knowing that they already want to work with you. And your sales conversations are totally different when somebody approaches you and wants to work with you rather than when you outreach to them. And so that's why you actually want to do this. And part of the reason why I want to build authority is to generate leads. But there are some issues, some difficulties with building authority. And there's three in particular that I find that people encounter. And the first is that it's simply slow. It's a process that's measured in months and years, not days and weeks. And so we have to find ways to help with that or counter that or do something alongside that. The second problem is that creating content itself, just the process of creating content, is quite time consuming as well. And it's usually never urgent, but always important. And so it gets put on the back finger. It gets left for another day because we're firefighting. And so quite often we don't prioritize content creation and just the time needed for that. And so we need to find a way to deal with that problem as well. And then the third thing is kind of interrelated, which is that it's simply difficult to know what type of content to create, both in the format and in the topics. And there's so many different options and choices around that. And you can spin your wheels creating a lot of content that's not actually effective in building authority and generating leads. And so we need to find a way to deal with that as well. And I've been working with my clients one-to-one and in group masterminds for the past several years to try and solve these problems. And I believe that I have some good solutions. I'm going to share one of these with you today, this particular process that I'm using with my clients now in what I call Authority Accelerator V2. I'm going to share the whole process for that. So I'm going to go through step by step with how I actually work with my clients in doing this. And then you can take this process and you can implement it yourself. Or if you feel like you want to work with me, you can reach out. And I'm going to give you a behind the scenes look at my process and what I recommend that you do. So the first thing is just to talk about how I think about an authority platform. I see this as something that we have total control over in how we choose to create our authority platform. And it's made up of multiple components. So for example, I personally have this podcast and several other podcasts. I have several books. I have a YouTube channel. You may have some of those elements and not others, and that's okay. You get to choose which of those you experiment with. Now, because I am in the business of helping people to build authority, that's one of the reasons why I tend to do everything, or at least try everything, because I want to be able to speak with my clients from the point of view of, I've actually tried that, here's how it went. And so I wouldn't actually recommend that people do like I do, because I think that it's more important to focus on a smaller number of channels and components and kind of double down on those rather than going too broad. But what I really like about the authority platform is you get to choose the mix, the way that you set it up, and you have total control over certain elements of it. And one of those types of channels or platforms is a podcast. Now, I really like podcasts for many reasons, but one of those is because when we create a podcast, we can position it. We have total control over it. We decide the format, the length, the frequency, the type of podcast, whether it's video or audio. We have total control over all of those things, and you can position it how you want to. And you can position it so that it makes sense to invite certain types of people on, or you can make it a solo podcast, and all of those choices. And so what we're trying to do here is create a platform and create a podcast as a platform where you, the expert, are being platformed so that your expertise is being demonstrated. And this is actually one of the flaws of the traditional interview podcast, because what happens is when you have a traditional interview podcast, you typically bring in an outside expert and they're going to speak for the majority of the episode. And I see this typically where the talk time is for me as a podcast host is 15 to 25% of the time. And the talk time for the guest is 75 to 85%. And that's on a traditional interview show. And that's absolutely normal because you're bringing on the guests to share their expertise. So that's what we want. The problem is, if you are the podcast owner, this does not platform you as the expert. And so how can we set this up in such a way as it makes sense to have you platformed and speaking as the expert? And so what normally people will do is they'll do solo episodes, a bit like what I'm doing right now. Now, if you've never done a solo episode, if you haven't recorded solo video or audio, then you may not be familiar, but it's actually really hard to do. There's an outlining process, there's scripting. It's hard to look at the camera, record the episode. And so how can you do all of that? The key for me is for the expert to be interviewed. I think that's the thing that unlocks so much here is the interview. And so the way that I work with my clients is I actually interview them on their podcast. And it doesn't have to be me doing the interview. It could be anybody who's able to interview you for your podcast. And what this allows you to do is to have you platformed as an expert on your own show. And you're speaking in a very normal way in a conversation. And that's much easier to do, to get on a podcast and get on a Zoom call and have a conversation rather than looking at a camera and trying to hit record and speak to your bullets. It's much more difficult to do it that way. So the interview is a key part of this. What this allows you to do is to be platformed as an expert on your own show, and you're speaking in a very normal, conversational, easy way. And all you're doing is you're getting on a Zoom call or going into a virtual recording studio with somebody who you know, and they're asking you questions on your expert area. You're just answering questions. And this is creating expert content, and it's creating it much quicker than if you were to try and do it solo. So this is the first key point or step in the process, is for you as the expert to be interviewed on your own show. And that's a crucial point. And I'm not trying to pitch you to use my services. You can have a friend or a colleague interview you. It just has to be somebody who can ask you intelligent questions about your topic. And we're solving a major content creation problem through conversation here. So the next piece of the puzzle is, how do we solve for the fact that building authority itself is actually slow? And because it's slow, it doesn't generate leads quickly. And one of the reasons why we want to do this is in order to generate leads. And if creating content is not generating leads for us, then it is deprioritized. It is not urgent, because generating leads is usually something that's more urgent because it's tied to cash flow and revenue. And so how can we make this something that actually generates leads for us? So the next part of the framework in my process is to actually position and create the podcast in such a way that it makes sense, that apart from you being interviewed on your own podcast, it also makes sense for you to invite your ideal clients, your potential clients, onto this podcast. And if you do this in the right way, if you come at this from the point of view that you're positioning them and platforming them as an expert, and you want to hear their story and tell their story, then you can do this in a very genuine way. Now, this will absolutely fail miserably if you come at it from the point of view where your intention is to try and pitch them when they come on your podcast. If you've got to do that, it's going to fail, because they will feel like you've betrayed them. They'll feel that you've invited them on and you've done a bait and switch by trying to pitch to them. And so make sure that you set an intention, set your goal as to simply build a relationship with somebody who may be fit your ideal client avatar, who may be an ideal prospective client. But the goal is to build a relationship with them, not to pitch to them. And there are various different things that you can do, but the most important thing is to not directly pitch them. And maybe they will choose to say, hey, can you tell me more about your services? And if they do, that's great. You can get into that conversation. But if they don't, then you don't want to pitch them at that point, because that will poison the well. It will destroy the relationship and trust that you've built up with them. The whole point here is simply to build a relationship with people who are ideal clients in your field. And with those relationships, if you build up enough of those relationships over time, which may be a short period of time, if you build up enough of those relationships, you will get business from it. It's inevitable. But it's important that you come at this from the point of view of putting their best interest first. And their best interest in this case is for you to platform them and interview them and have a conversation with them. And so when I talk to people who work with me, I talk through, how do you actually do that? Like the details of the way that you pitch the podcast invite and what you talk about before and after the show, because that's actually quite important. The minor detail is important there. And again, you must absolutely be coming at this from the point of view of you are there to serve them and platform them, not to try and pitch them your services. That's the most crucial takeaway, I think, that I hope that you get from this piece of the conversation. In fact, maybe the whole episode. This is key. Okay, so there's another piece of the puzzle, that another problem that people have with creating content is simply not knowing what kind of content to create, or having any kind of content strategy or any kind of overall plan. And the way that I solve this personally is through the very first interview that I do with clients. And it's in the questions that I ask. And the key here is to ask all of the questions that you need to create a content strategy. It's so simple, really. But if you get all of the questions that you need to create the content strategy, you can then manually, or with the help of AI assistance, we can create a content strategy based on that first conversation. And that's one of the really powerful things about podcasting, and the way that these AI tools can process all of this expert text. When we have a podcast conversation transcript, it's expert text content from somebody who's an expert in their field, and that can act as a really good input into AI tools that we have. And if you give them good input and ask them the right questions in the right way, it can help you do things like generate a content strategy that's really effective. And I've even done some live demos of this. If you look back through my YouTube channel, and you'll see I've done some live demos where I think one of them I made a unique value proposition in 12 minutes using ChatGPT. And you can do this if you give it the right input. If you give these tools the right input, they will produce really good output. It depends on the quality of the input that you give them. So the way that I solve this personally is through the very first interview that I do with my clients is I ask questions in such a way that we get all of the information that we need to create a content strategy. So it's that simple, just asking the right questions in that first podcast episode. And then manually or with the help of AI assistants, we can create our podcast strategy, all our content themes, topics, pillar content, all of that. We can create a full strategy around that based on that first conversation. And so that's one of the really powerful things about podcasting when you combine it with AI tools, because podcast conversations can be transcribed. That transcription can then be used as text input for AI. And AI actually can work really well when you give it good input, when you give it expert input, which is what this real conversation with an expert is. And if you give it good input and ask the right questions, it can help you do things like generate a content strategy that's actually effective. And I've done some live demos of this. If you look at my YouTube channel, and you see that I made a unique value proposition, a UVP, in 12 minutes live using ChatGPT, and I'd never actually done it before using those tools. But if you give it the right input and you ask the right questions, then it can be really effective in creating that. So this is solving the third problem of not knowing what to talk about. Okay, so let's go back over the process that I'm talking you through here. And this is the process that I take my clients through. And the first thing that we do is we plan the podcast. And so with some of the people I've worked with, they already have a podcast. They need to reboot it. Sam, you'll hear in a minute, is one of those people. And what we're doing is we're just changing and tweaking the positioning of the podcast, the way that it's described, in order to make sense for the expert to be interviewed, the podcast owner to be interviewed as an expert on there, but also for them to bring other people on. And so it's just the way that you describe it, the wording that you use there, you can tweak that to make it make sense. And this is important because remember, you're inviting people onto this podcast. And so it has to make sense to them when they look at the podcast description. It has to make sense to them to want to go on that podcast. So that's the first thing we do, is we do the podcast planning. The next thing that we do in my process is I will do an interview where I interview them. That will be the first interview. And we do that one as early as possible because I can then use that as input into the process where we do the content strategy. And so that interview, I like to do that as early as possible. And then the next thing that I'll do is I'll create the content strategy, the UVP, and all of those things from that first interview. And then the next thing that we do is we record a second interview and then publish at least 2 of those, so that we have a podcast live, so that you can point at that when you're saying, hey, we'd like to invite you. And then you start contacting your ideal potential clients, your prospective clients who you'd like to invite onto your platform, because you now have a platform live. So that's the process that we go through, and then start recording those next interviews. We do some planning for what those look like and going through some of the questions. So I'm going to now give you an opportunity to hear from Sam Glynn. And Sam has just gone through the first call, actually, where we planned the podcast and did interview number 1. And Sam actually insisted that we get on and immediately record like a conversation, like a video testimonial, because he was so positive about the program. Okay, so I'm here with Sam Glynn. And Sam, you've just gone through the first stage of the Authority Accelerator process with me. And we've just recorded a podcast episode for the kind of the rebooting of your podcast. And I just want to talk to you a little bit about how you feel about what we've just gone through in the process, because I think you had some interesting things to say about that. So we had literally our first meeting this morning where we planned your podcast and then we actually recorded the first episode. Can you talk to me a little bit about your experience with that?
Yeah, I mean, like you mentioned that we're rebooting my podcast. I suppose as I described to you, I have a podcast, but it's sitting in the corner waiting for someone to ask it to dance. I have the plumbing, but it doesn't do anything. Like at the minute, I do a lot of writing online, and really I just record a monologue of what I've written. So really, it's been there to kind of get into the habit, but I haven't known how to do anything of value with it. So that's why I saw your accelerator program and thought, yeah, this is what I need. And I suppose I'll tell you what I didn't get, and this is a positive. I was expecting, as I've signed up for a lot of these types of things before, where you go, okay, we're going to sign up for workshop number 1. And before we go into the workshop, here's a spreadsheet or a Google Doc or whatever, fill in these 40 questions or whatever like that. And they're the things where it's friction, because you're like, okay, well, they're valuable questions, of course, but I've got other things to do, and I'd much prefer to just talk to someone. You get the information out of me. So I was right up to the time where we were joining the meeting. I was waiting for this 40 question questionnaire, and I never got one. So then, when we came on and you said, "No, this is the process," we'll talk. That was fantastic just in itself. So as a first minute realization that your process doesn't involve lots of homework, I thought that was excellent. As well as that, I mean, I don't know who's going to be doing the accelerator. I do find it interesting that I'm in a very kind of niche place in terms of cybersecurity, which may or may not be very niche, but then it's also with regulated financial services companies, which is quite niche, and then very specific regulations that they need to deal with. So it kind of gets very, very, very niche. Obviously not an area that you're au fait with or that you live in. And I just found that just from the few minutes of conversation that you had with me, which felt very natural, when we got into doing the interview, it was as if you worked in the industry. You knew enough to ask intelligent questions, and the questions flowed really naturally. So I'm sure you're working off of a question template, this, and this. It certainly didn't feel that way to me. And I can't wait to hear the recording, because it feels like it was a natural conversation, even though you weren't an expert in the area, but you were asking the right questions off the back of the interview. So it was an excellent experience in that sense.
Yeah, that's great to hear. I mean, one of the reasons why I call this Accelerator is because I do want to help people to move faster, because building authority is slow and creating content is slow. And the whole point of this is to help people to increase the speed of production and publishing. Now, normally, I have to say, normally when I'm working with people, we record the first interview on the second call, not the first call. The first call is usually about planning and things like that, and sometimes they may even need to upgrade their microphone. That's why I suggest to a lot of people. But you had actually upgraded your microphone.
Yeah, sure. I took all your free advice and did all those things. So
yeah, so
yeah,
that's super. And then the other thing is, I do have a template of questions that I ask, and they're specifically designed to get the most out of the interview and out of you. But the bit of conversation that we had beforehand does help me to figure out what, the right way to make those questions flow.
Yeah. And just before you finish, like, and I find this as well. I mean, I'm terrible at sales, but I'm very good at servicing or helping or whatever it is. So when I'm talking to a prospect or a lead, we'll be in conversation about what it is I do and what they're trying to do, and just see if there's a fit. And I just find the conversations are very eye-opening to me, because it tells, I hear myself saying certain things and go, until someone asked me that question, I didn't really actually realize, even though I've just said it, I didn't realize that's what I do, or that's my angle, or that's my perspective. And even in the interview that you had there that we just recorded, when I listen back, I'm going to listen back to it and go, I have never explained that that's how I do things, or that's what I think, until you asked, as I say, the intelligent questions, So it was, even if nobody listens to this, me listening to it will help me with my positioning, and help me for when I'm talking to a prospect to explain, what it is I do, because I've had this conversation with you.
One of the reasons why I think this is so powerful is because of the interview aspect. Because I have recorded many solo episodes like you have, and it is hard. It's hard to look at a camera, or even if you're just doing audio, it's hard just to speak and kind of to either to work off of a script or a bullet point outline, or extemporaneously if some people are doing that. But it's really hard to do a solo show, and that's why I think being interviewed is so, it's like that's the real accelerating part, I think. How did you feel about that?
Yeah. He actually just reminded me that one of my very good friends, when I launched the podcast, which, as I say, has been sitting in the corner, one of my very good friends subscribed, and then 3 weeks later, he said I had to unsubscribe. And I said, why? And he goes, because you don't sound like you. I don't know who that is, but that's not you. You're not speaking in the cadence, your language, because it's very much, when you're doing a monologue, you're planning it. To a large extent, you're writing down the sentences you're going to say, to make sure that you get a start, middle, and end. And it's just unnatural. Whereas a conversation is a much more natural thing. And I think, I go in and out of listening to podcasts, and following different podcasts, but the ones I go back to are the ones where it is just a conversation, and it's the conversations where there just seems to be a kind of a link between the two people. not a lot of prep, but they just seem to kind of get on and they just want to talk about whatever the topic is. And you're in on the conversation. It's just so much more natural, whereas a monologue it's very hard having done it myself. It isn't long enough. Like people say, well, what's the point in an episode that's 7 minutes long or 10 minutes long? And anything longer than that, it's like, well, you might as well be up at the pulpit preaching to people, because you're just going, oh, this is what I think. And whereas a conversation is you're asking me intelligent questions and I'm just giving you answers, and hopefully they're intelligent answers. The stress of it, the planning of it, all of that, the kind of emotional burden of doing it is much easier.
The other part of Authority Accelerator is I want to help people to create a platform that they can then invite people in their industry into, ideal clients, other people, leaders in the industry, people with big networks. I want to make it so that you have a platform, because I sincerely believe there is no better LinkedIn invite than "I'd love to have you be a guest on my podcast." That is never going to get refused. And so planning that and creating a platform and creating a podcast where you position it so that it makes sense to invite somebody on and have them come on and talk with you. Can you tell me a little bit about how you felt about how we did that? Because that was something that we spent a good part of today's call on.
Yeah. Which is probably what you do in your first workshop, is trying to figure out where the podcast is. I suppose I spent a lot of time figuring out where is my, unique value proposition, or whatever you'd call it. Where do I add most value? Who is it I help? What is their problem? What is the problem where they put their hand up and say, you know what, let's have a conversation with Sam. I've done a lot of that, and what's helped me with that is actually conversations. So not necessarily podcasts, because I wasn't out there plugging this, but it was conversations with people just to say, oh, I think I can help someone like you. And then more often than not, finding out why I'm not the person that they would choose. They will go to a bigger consultancy firm, or they'll do it in-house, or they'll do whatever. So I think, now that I kind of have a clearer view of who I help, and now being able to say, well, if you are someone like this, obviously I can help you, but I really value conversations with someone like you, even if, I'll never be engaged by you. I like to understand your world because I'm helping people just like you. So being able to go out to people, my ideal client, from a selfish perspective is very valuable to me, because I will learn from the conversation. But if you turn it around and say, well, what does the person who I've invited onto the podcast get? We get to talk about the topic that they're struggling with. They're in the trenches on this particular topic. They get to, I suppose, be a bit more visible themselves, because as most of us have realized, the whole idea of a job for life is coming to an end. We have different careers. We'll move from one job to another, and more and more, it's all about your visibility. So being able to have a podcast which enables, my ideal target, my ideal client, to have a platform to discuss, their perspective on the world, has to be beneficial to them as well. So suddenly now this conversation, which is going to be in public, recorded as a podcast, has massive value for both of us, regardless of the fact that it may or may not lead to us working together in the future. But it has to have both sides.
I think that's a crucial point, and this is something that I talk to people about, and it's why, if anybody has ever seen any time I've spoken about the Authority Accelerator, I always say that this is only for people who have a fiduciary responsibility towards their clients, or people who you put the other person's best interest first. Because if you come into this thinking, I'm going to create a podcast where I'm going to invite my ideal client on, and then I'm going to pitch to them immediately afterwards, then it's going to fail miserably, because they're going to feel that desperation, that desperate pitch. They're going to know, and it's going to poison the well, because it's not creating a good relationship, and it's going to really annoy people. So I think that it's super important the way that this is about relationship building, not about pitching to people. And I think that's really crucial in how you actually set it up.
And in a way, it's nearly, your process, I think, will actually teach people like me how to just have conversations, whether it's podcasts or not. But if someone, I do get referrals. That's the nature of a business, which I know is not a long-term strategy, but we won't talk about that here. But, I'll get a call from someone who said, oh, such a person over here, you help them. They suggested I call you. And they're the conversations I have, is just tell me about your situation. Here's the things I think you should do. And more often than not, I'm saying to them, I think the best solution for you is go and do this. More often than not, I'm not saying I am the solution for you, because, you know, we all have our very specific maximum value place. But having those conversations, being better at those conversations, regardless of the podcast, like the podcast in a way is you're just doing the same conversation, but you're recording it. So it's not like another thing to do. But instead of it being someone who puts their hand up and says, I'd like to talk to you because I think you might be able to help me, you're going out to someone that you would like to help, but it's only to have a conversation with them. And then they can self-select after the interview to say, you know what, actually, now that we've kind of got to know each other, you know, maybe we should talk a bit more about how maybe you could help us. I think you had a podcast there recently with David Newman, I think, is it?
Yeah.
Where the thing that really hit me is when you have a prospecting call and you think of it as a sales call, and, you know, for whatever reason, that doesn't become a client. I think it was either yourself or himself said, there's a double whammy there. You didn't get the sale, but you've also been rejected. So personally,
I think David said you feel this personal rejection.
Yeah, because you're selling yourself. You know, I
Mhm.
mean, yeah, we talk about we run a business and we're consultants, but you're selling your own skills. So when someone says no, you're not the right fit. You know, it's different if you say no, I'm not the right fit for you. I think you should go there. But if you think you are the right fit and the person goes no, then there's a kind of a psychological bang there. So if you have a process, which this kind of teaches, of you're not on that call to sell, you're on that call to help. You're recording this to actually help the person as they're in the trenches. And the flip side of it is, if you help, A, it's in public, so other people will see how you work. But B, you know, there's a natural human desire to say, well, if you've helped me, I'd like to help you. So whether that is, I'd like to help you by bringing you in and, you know, helping you pay your mortgage, or whether it's, I'd like to help you by referring you on to the people that are in my network, you know, and extending out your reach. They're both very valuable outcomes from just a call where you're being helpful. And I think that's what this will help me with, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it comes back to, you've got this platform where you can invite people on. And so you're platforming somebody else, you're inviting them, and it's as a type of outreach, and I'm not a big fan of outreach, but as a type of outreach, I think it's the least worst, because
Yeah.
you're inviting somebody into your space. I claim in the marketing for Authority Accelerator that it helps you to create authority content and a lead generation platform. Do you think, based on what we've done so far, do you think that that claim is correct?
I think the authority platform, what I have found, is when I kind of meet people more and more face to face, but sometimes on Zoom, people that know me and like me and trust me and all that kind of stuff, people I've worked with before, or ex-colleagues, and I talk to them about their world. You know, I get their angle on things, but I also get the language. There's, you know, people have a way of describing things, and when you're outside helping them, you don't have the same language. You know, it's nearly the way that they describe things will be in their world. They're in the jar, and it's getting those insights. You know, they're looking at things from a slightly different angle, and then you find yourself just naturally turning towards that kind of perspective and saying, well, if that's where they are and that's how they see the world, you know, you get better at talking about their world in their, you know, just using their language, just using, understanding that, you know, like my world of cybersecurity, it's not really cybersecurity that they're worried about. It's regulations, it's risk, you know, and just understanding that, it just changes the nature of things. So that, in terms of building your authority, like being able to say, I know your world, you know, and use the same language and same, you know, not in a scammy way, but just say, look, I know, I've spoken to people like you. There's a podcast here which demonstrates that I speak to people like you and I understand the problems. They've described them to me. You know, you get better at solving the problem because you understand their problem. So being able to build an authority, which is really just say, I understand your world, you know, I not an authority in your world. No, I understand your world. I have solved this problem that you're now having because I am doing this all the time and I'm speaking to people all the time. That's got to be something, like even just from a few conversations I've had with people where I've gotten certain phrases and angles from them. And then I've kind of replayed those back on the next call that I've had with somebody else. You can see it, you know, it's nearly like they're moving away from the camera going, yeah, you know, it's nearly their answers have fewer words in them because they just go, yeah, you get it. I understand, you're definitely on my wavelength. You're an authority
You
on
get
this.
me, you're on my wavelength, you
Yeah,
understand. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And then on the
Which
lead gen side, yeah. I mean, like I have a certain number of followers on LinkedIn. I publish on LinkedIn all the time. I find it very useful. I write to think, I write to kind of learn. I get a lot of kind of interaction from that. And an email list. I have a few hundred people on an email list. But there are times where you go, there's someone there that I would love to get in front of, to kind of have a reason to have a conversation with them, because they're clearly in the role that I help. Like, I'm very clear on the person that I'm helping because I know what their problem is, back to the conversations and the authority. But I don't have a vehicle to kind of go out to them and say, like traditionally you'd go out and say, hey, I do these things. I think you could use my help. Can we connect? And, you kind of go, well, that's a pitch. So
that
no,
doesn't work anymore.
yeah. Whereas if you say, I have this platform, I have this podcast, I record conversations, and there's a history there. So it's not like, you're only saying that. You're just lining up a conversation with me. It's like, no, there's, over time, I will have conversations with people just like him or just like her. So it's not a pitch. It's like, well, I'm having conversations. Would you be interested in a conversation? I think you have insight. I think there are other people, your colleagues or your peers, that would really appreciate your insight. And that is the mechanism to make the connection. And that is all you're asking. Like, behind this, you're not saying, oh, well, get him on the interview and then 2 days later send him this thing. That's not the nature of what your program is. It's no, make the connection, make the human connection, and kind of nearly see where it goes, but it will go somewhere.
I do have
Valuable.
specific suggestions on ways to follow up with people,
Mhm.
and none of them involve asking them to work directly with you.
Yeah. Yeah.
That will come if it's going to come, it'll come naturally, but none of them are any kind of pitch, because I
Yeah.
think that is the most off-putting thing that you can do, and like I just feel that that will then poison the well of this thing that you're trying to make.
Yeah. I mean, like, how can you be? I mean, authority is fair enough. You can be sales pitchy and be an authority. But how can you say, I'm your trusted advisor. You can trust me. If the relationship starts out or gets kind of colored by buy this, buy this, buy this. It's nearly, it has to be better where you say, look, this is what I do. We've had a conversation. We've made a connection. We've understood the worlds that we both come from. And therefore I'm front of mind that if something of this nature comes up and you're looking for help and you understand how I help and where I am a good fit and where I'm not, then you have to assume the person is going to come back in contact, or ensure that you're put in front of those who
Unless
have it.
you've given a horrible pitch. That's pretty much the only case where it won't actually work, because you've done the complete opposite, I think.
But
Um,
I think like lots of people like me, fair enough, our ability to market and to sell, that's how we pay our mortgages. But we are terrible at marketing and terrible at selling. And really what we would prefer to do is just serve, just do the job, just do the whatever the expert thing that we do. But it's the nature of it. We work for ourselves, or we work in a small firm, and someone has to do this. We don't have a salesperson to do this for us. So
and
this is
so, yeah,
it's a nice way to do it. It
for me, the goal here, because I don't particularly like marketing and sales in any kind of traditional sense, the goal here is to turn that whole thing into simple conversations.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
happen to be recording them. That's all. We happen to be recording and publishing them, but it's turning your marketing and sales mechanism into just having conversations with people.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And like I said, I think the habit and the skill that you're kind of teaching me of how do you have a conversation with people and record it, that will just naturally reflect back into those conversations I have when there's not even anything being recorded. It's no longer a pre-sales call. It's no longer someone's calling me, I better be ready to pitch them. It's not. It's just we're having a conversation. And I know that through the podcast or through one-to-one conversations, that these conversations, so long as you provide value and you ask intelligent questions, you've got some insights gained from the conversations you've had through your podcast, that you're significantly increasing the likelihood that something valuable will come from that conversation.
Final question for you on this. Would you recommend that people try out the Authority Accelerator? And who would you recommend it to if you did?
Oh, well, after all I said, no, I wouldn't. No. Of course, yeah, I would recommend it. I think, for all the reasons I've kind of said, I think that the lack of the homework, I think is it's kind of, I don't even think you say that in terms of the program, but the thing of we schedule a slot and we do the work at the start and it ends at the end. I think that at least when we're kicking off, I mean, I'm sure that there's questions you might have asked me where I have to go away and have a think about that, but you're not asking me to do loads of homework. But in terms of who, I think I mean, I can only speak for myself. I mean, I've been doing a lot. If anyone looks me up on LinkedIn or whatever, they can see I do a lot of writing. I do a lot of not pitching, but it's just trying to be helpful, just trying to explain to people how to do this without losing their sanity. And I enjoy it, but at the end of the day, you've got to bring, work through the door. And I just, as much as you read about the sales and how to do sales and how to convert calls, it's just not me. As I said, I would so much prefer if clients magically came to me and the sale was done and then you just got on with doing your work. So I think anyone that's in that boat, which said, oh, well, in an ideal world, if someone else did the sales or if the sales just magically appeared, I would be delighted with that. I think this is a nice way to do it because it is marketing and it is positioning without it feeling like that. It doesn't feel icky. It doesn't feel, I can't believe I'm doing this because I hate when I'm on the receiving end of this kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think conversations, if people are focused on serving and doing the right thing for the client, your phrase of the fiduciary responsibility, think of your client's needs first. If you're on calls where you sometimes say to them, yeah, I could help you, but I'm not the best option. I think you should try this first. I think that would be the better way for you to go. Or I think you need to do this first and then we can have a conversation. If you're that kind of person, rather than every single call you get, you need to get something out of it, then I think this has to be a good way to go. To me, it's a much more natural way.
Awesome. Sam, where can people find you if they're interested in checking out your podcast and your blog and things like that?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn as Sam Glynn, I think. And if you look up on LinkedIn, you'll see a hell of a lot of articles around cybersecurity and plain English cyber advice. Or else at codeinmotion.ie is the name of my consultancy firm.
Awesome. Sam, thank you for coming on and being willing to chat about the whole process. I appreciate it.
It's a bit meta though, because you're interviewing me about the process that you bring people through to interview people, but I'm already a client, so it's not quite the same. But yeah, look, if this is helpful to you, I'm delighted because it has been.
I truly appreciate it.
Yeah.
So I love having these kind of conversations because I always learn so much from it as well. And in fact, it even helps me with my marketing, having these conversations, figuring out what's important to people. I love that Sam pointed out how important it is not to have any homework before the call, because that's something that I wanted to do. I know people are busy, but I don't know how important that is for people who are potentially my clients. And it's really obviously something that jumped out for him. And so, yeah, I like to make it so that we do the work on the calls and that's all there is. And the other part is it helped him to clarify his positioning. And I think that having these conversations, if you ask the right questions, it really does help you nail down your positioning, because you're having to describe what you do and who you do it for. And then we're creating this platform where he doesn't have to do any of that horrible sales and marketing that he talked about. And it aligns with integrity and value and serving. And that for me is super important, because the goal here is to build authority and generate leads through conversations, through natural conversations where we're not doing a hard sales pitch like in the Glengarry, Glen Ross film, where the always be closing type of approach to sales and marketing. And one thing that I want to mention is Sam talked about he already had a podcast, but it was sitting languishing in the corner. I love the way he described it as sitting in the corner waiting for somebody to ask it to dance. I work with people who already have a podcast and people who don't already have a podcast, but who are willing to create one. And I can help you walk you through all the steps involved in that. The program itself is steeply discounted right now while I'm in this pilot period, which is going to be for the next 2 weeks or so. This is version 2 of the Authority Accelerator, and I'm trying to get some more folks like Sam who are willing to come on and share their experience. And so that's why it's discounted, because I'm asking people to do a video testimonial like this one. And I would love to work with you if you think that it would be useful to build authority, generate leads through conversations. So if that sounds like a good fit, then please reach out to me. You can find a link in the show notes. And the other thing I want to mention is this is actually episode 150 of the podcast. And if you have listened to all 150 episodes, then thank you so much for being a listener. I don't expect that you have. If you haven't, then there are lots of interesting conversations in the archives, and all of the topics are evergreen and relevant for you. I've had some amazing people on as guests, people like David Newman, John Lee Dumas, Bob Berg, Monique Mill, Rejay Redmond, Cheryl Plouffe, Evelyn Starr, Rochelle Moulton, Ron Baker, Michael Zapersky, Marcus Sheridan, Chris Doe. All of these really amazing people, and they've all come on and share their expertise and their knowledge with us. And so that's all in the back archive. So do check that out. And you can find all of those on the podcast page. I'll put up a link to the archive page as well. So thanks again for listening, and thanks again for sticking with this podcast. If you got this far in the podcast, I really do appreciate you. And have a great holiday season. And I hope that you have an amazing start to 2024. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to The Recognized Authority with Alastair McDermott. Subscribe today and don't miss an episode. Find out more at therecognizedauthority.com.